Well, thank you very much for that kind introduction, and thank you everybody for coming on what is one of the coldest nights I've experienced in Philadelphia. It reminds me of the days in Ann Arbor, Michigan, where, I kid you not, one day the wind chill was minus 40 in Ann Arbor, and we had the good fortune to watch on the news that the wind chill in Chicago that day was minus 80. So it's actually not so bad here. I'm going to start by some reflections on space and time and the development of the Gilgamesh narratives. And then I'm going to tell you a little bit of the stories associated with Gilgamesh. And then I'm going to try to explain them a little bit. It's a huge topic, so I'm going to leave a lot out. And I'm afraid you'll have to forgive me for that. Otherwise, we'd be here overnight. And I don't think anybody's quite ready for that. So I want to start, since the topic of this lecture series is Great Voyages, I thought it would be appropriate to start by thinking about maps and mapping. We have a very privileged view of maps these days. They're easily available to us. They are fairly accurate. We can play with them. We are, by the way, on this previous slide, oops, I pressed too fast. We are on the edge of, still getting used to this. We are on the edge of the world over here. I don't know where the light is, but you see where we are. We can zoom in. This is more or less the known world in ancient Mesopotamia. While it's up here, I'll mention that pieces of Gilgamesh traditions, which are long-lived traditions, come from a whole range of sites. The dot marked with the A there is the site of Uruk, the city of Uruk, where Gilgamesh comes from, and which is our focus this evening. But all up and down the Tigris-Euphrates corridor, the area we call Mesopotamia, there are sites that have yielded Gilgamesh fragments and tablets at various times. And all the way up into Turkey, ancient Turkey, the Hittites knew Gilgamesh and translated it into Hittite. There are some pieces of translation into Hittite. Down along the shore there, through what is now Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, Israel, we have fragments of Gilgamesh from all over. So the Gilgamesh traditions were known all over the ancient world. And Gilgamesh's voyages take him both into the ancient known extremes. We'll start by going to Mount Lebanon. And they take him beyond that to where the flood survivor lived. And that's the second voyage we'll look at. So we can zoom in, we can see satellite imagery. When the satellite imagery is not interesting enough, we can make three-dimensional reconstructions of ancient Uruk. We're very lucky. This is the Mesopotamian worldview. This is the famous map of the world that is now in the British Museum, and the image, like a number of other pieces from the British Museum featured tonight, comes from the British Museum's outstanding online collections database, where you can go on and search for pieces that are of interest by keywords and by the descriptive text. And if you sign up, you can get high-definition images of them to use for your own research. It's a wonderful service. So this map was written, let's say, in the 7th century BCE in a city called Sippar. And it's quite interesting because it's a little like one of those joke maps you see, the world according to New Yorkers, that kind of thing. Because what you're seeing, that circular band around there, that's essentially the sea, the bitter water. And that rectangle just below it, in the middle, that's Babylon. So this is the world as seen from Babylon. Fairly straightforward place. A few regions that are marked with circles, a few waterways, and then at the outer edge, these pointy, triangular protuberances, which are called Nagu, areas, zones, regions, and which are probably mountainous. The text is very difficult to understand and rather broken, but it mentions the flood survivor, Utnapishtim. We'll come back to him later. So there's a connection between this and the Gilgamesh narratives. When we think about their view of their journeys, their view of space, it's very different from ours. We can visualize space in a way that they couldn't. Their mental maps are very different. Back to Uruk. I'm going to come back to Uruk repeatedly, partly because Gilgamesh does, and I thought that was a nice piece of homology, and partly because the talk consists of several discrete sections, and I'm going to try to mark them off with this slide. Uruk, to all intents and purposes, is where cities began in Mesopotamia. Now, I'm saying that knowing that this lecture may go on YouTube, and my colleagues may say, but, and it's true, but. We don't have enough archaeology of the very early periods of some of the major centers like Umma to be sure that there was only Uruk at the invention of cities. But nevertheless, what we do have from Uruk are the earliest written texts. We like to say they're the earliest written texts known. And this is an example of one. This is written in pictograms. It probably dates to about 3000, 3200 BCE. We can say the language is Sumerian. Not everybody in the world agrees with that, but it's very likely. And the writing system works both by depicting concepts and by agglomerating concepts. So in the bottom left corner, what you see is a pictogram of a head, and to the right of it, what you see is a pictogram of a food bowl, and together they make the concept of eating. We understand these texts after a manner, but they're quite hard to translate. A few hundred years after the invention of writing, Gilgamesh first appears. This tablet is a list of gods from the ancient city of Farah. Let's say it dates to 2600, 2700 BCE. It's quite difficult to date these earlier periods closely in absolute terms. Each of the cases is a god, and on the reverse there, it's a little bit fuzzy because I zoomed in so much, that's the name Gilgamesh. I can walk over to it. Dingir, Gish, Bil, Pap, Ga, Mes. All those signs together is one way of writing Gilgamesh. The name probably had various forms, probably had various realizations. Sometimes you'll see Bilgamesh, for example, in the published literature. Same thing. So Gilgamesh is a god, let's say around 2600, and he receives some offerings. This is a mace from the Louvre. Here you see again, you can read this by now, right? Dingir, Gish, Bil, Ga, Pap, and then the sign beside it is Lugal, king. So this is for Gilgamesh, his king. The ruler so-and-so dedicated this mace head for his life. It's a votive offering. At the same time, during this third millennium tradition, Gilgamesh is probably thought of as an early real king, not just a god. Now, we don't have direct documentary evidence of his existence, and honestly, I don't think it's that interesting whether he really lived or not. It doesn't matter much for the traditions. This object is in the Ashmolean Museum. It's one of the best preserved manuscripts, probably the best preserved manuscript of the Sumerian king list. And this is a document which claims to list all the kings that ever ruled in Mesopotamia. And sure enough, right there, as you can no doubt see, yes? Come on, work with me. Dingir, Gish, Bil, Ga, Mes, Gilgamesh. Adani Lila, his father was a spirit phantom. Lil's an interesting word. The wind that whistles in the ruins of devastated cities. Some people translate it as phantom. Gilgamesh's father is claimed to have been unknown in the king list, which is quite interesting in itself. This prism, this object, would have been written around, let's say, 1750 BC. They also had a concurrent tradition that Gilgamesh's parents were partly divine. Gilgamesh's mother was Ninsun, a goddess, and Gilgamesh's father was Lugal-Banda, an officer in the army of Uruk. So you see, when we talk about tradition in Mesopotamia, we're not talking about a single fixed tradition that is in the heads of everybody who passes it on and interprets it and writes it down for future generations. We're talking about something that's malleable, that can be very positional. So when we think about the Voyages of Gilgamesh, we think about not only the way that they're configured, but also the ways in which they mean within their own contexts. At the end, Adani Lilla, En Kulabake, the lord of Kulaba. Kulaba is a part of Uruk. Mood, and then 26, I'm just going to say in English, Eak, reigned for 26 years. So it's set up as an entry for a real king. This is part of their mindset. In ancient Mesopotamia, Gilgamesh was an early king who became a god. He was born two-thirds a god. Around the same time as the king list, children learning Sumerian are writing tablets like this. Another social context of the Gilgamesh tales. This is a tablet from our collections here at Penn. It's written in Sumerian, as I said, and it's part of the curriculum. It's a tablet which gives part of the story of Gilgamesh and Huwawa. Gilgamesh and Huwawa is the major episode in which Gilgamesh goes to the mountains and defeats, well, let's call Huwawa a monster, but I'll backtrack on that a little later. So already you can probably see we've got a variety of traditions and a variety of contexts over time. Here's another one. This is called, inventively, Gilgamesh P. This is also in our collection. I have a close-up of it. The tablet is a little bit abraded, so it doesn't photograph as well as some of the others in the slide sequence. This is written about 1600 or so in Sippar. This is interesting because it's part of the shift in the Gilgamesh narratives from Sumerian, the language of the early tales, into Akkadian. And the episode in here is part of the introduction of Enkidu, the sleeping with the prostitute that the townspeople send out to him, and the battle with Gilgamesh. So we have actually one of the more exciting Gilgamesh tablets, and it's one of very few early Akkadian Gilgamesh tablets, and it's the best preserved. So this is one of the prizes of our collection here. It's an unassuming tablet. When you look at it like this, it looks a bit dark and boring, but you should never judge a tablet by its color. And almost 1,000 years later, the tradition is evolving again. This is another very, very famous tablet, possibly the most famous tablet in cuneiform history. This is the Flood tablet. And this is now in the British Museum. This was the tablet that prompted the Daily Telegraph in England to send a separate expedition back to Ashurbanipal's libraries to see if they could find more. And you can probably see, if you look at this and think about the tablets that I've shown you, the tablets change in shape and form and writing. And by this period, the tablets are being written by highly trained scholars. They're part of the scholarly literature of the first millennium. And that's something I'll come back to later as well. Back to Uruk. So we have mental mapping, different views of space, and we have the Gilgamesh traditions, which are quite varied, which evolve over time, which have meanings situated within contexts that we have to think about rather than just the Gilgamesh epic. Now, that's actually a rather, I'm going to say, lame disclaimer I've just issued, because I'm going to talk about, mostly today, the Gilgamesh epic. But my way out of this is that when I talk about the Gilgamesh epic, I'm really talking about the one that you all know from things like the Penguin Classics, the one that was compiled by a scribe, or allegedly compiled by a scribe called Sinleki Uneni, and which is known in a series of 11 or 12 tablets, depending on exactly how we analyze it, from the first millennium. So it's the famous, well-known one, the Standard Babylonian epic. So I'm going to talk mostly about the Standard Babylonian epic, and I'm going to try not to range too far from that, but it's very hard because there are passages missing in the Standard Babylonian epic, and it's inevitable that we fill them in from other tablets.